The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military convoy as it wound through the rocky terrain of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison adjusted his medical kit one more time, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. As a Navy SEAL medic, he had seen more combat zones than most soldiers twice his age, but something about this particular mission felt different. The intelligence reports had been vague, mentioning only that they needed to extract a high-value target from a remote village. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of the engine noise. Contact ahead, 2 clicks out, came the voice of Lieutenant Rodriguez, their team leader. Jake's pulse quickened as he mentally ran through his medical protocols. In situations like these, every second could mean the difference between life and death. As they approached the village, the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Buildings stood damaged, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The convoy came to a halt near what appeared to be a small medical clinic, its red cross barely visible through the dust and debris. Jake grabbed his gear and followed his team toward the building, his training taking over as he assessed the scene for potential threats and casualties. Inside the clinic, chaos reigned. Local civilians huddled in corners, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Medical supplies were scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. Jake's eyes immediately went to work, categorizing the wounded by severity. That's when he saw her. She sat propped against the far wall, her long dark hair matted with dust and blood. Her clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting she had been caught in whatever conflict had torn through this place. What struck Jake immediately was her posture despite her obvious injuries. She held herself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the chaos around her. Her eyes, though filled with pain, held an alertness that reminded him of something familiar, though he couldn't quite place what. Jake approached her slowly, his medic instincts taking over. "Mom, Imam Medic. I'm here to help," he said softly, kneeling beside her. She looked up at him with those penetrating eyes, but said nothing. He noticed a deep gash on her left arm that would definitely need stitches, and her breathing suggested possible rib injuries. But what concerned him most was the way she seemed to be favoring her right leg. As he began his initial assessment, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this woman. Most civilians in these situations were either hysterical with fear or numb with shock. She was neither. Instead, she watched him work with the calculating gaze of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Her eyes tracked his movements as he opened his medical kit, noting how he organized his supplies and prioritized his treatments. "Can you tell me your name?" Jake asked gently as he cleaned the wound on her arm. She continued to watch him, but remained silent. He tried again in the limited Dari he had picked up during his deployments. Still nothing. The language barrier wasn't uncommon in these situations, but something about her silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of someone who didn't understand. It was the silence of someone choosing not to speak. As Jake worked on cleaning and bandaging her wounds, he found himself studying her more carefully. Her hands, despite being covered in dirt and blood, showed calluses and patterns he recognized. They weren't the calluses of someone who worked in fields or did manual labor. They were the specific marks left by weapons training, by hours spent gripping rifle stocks and rappelling ropes. His own hands bore similar marks. The way she held herself, even injured, spoke of military bearing. Her spine remained straight despite her obvious pain, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats and escape routes. Jake had seen enough soldiers to recognize the signs, but something didn't add up. Women weren't supposed to be in combat roles, especially not in this region. Yet everything about her screamed military training. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jake asked quietly as he worked on her leg wound. For just a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, a recognition of his words. But then the mask was back, and she remained silent. The wound on her leg was worse than he had initially thought. It looked like shrapnel damage, the kind caused by explosive devices. The edges were jagged and deep, requiring immediate attention. As he cleaned the wound, Jake noticed something that made him pause. There, partially hidden by dried blood and dirt, was what looked like a tattoo on her ankle. It was partially obscured, but he could make out what appeared to be numbers and possibly text. Military tattoos weren't uncommon, but this one looked American in style. His heart began to race as possibilities flooded through his mind. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted his thoughts. Their extraction was arriving ahead of schedule, which meant they needed to move fast. Jake quickly finished bandaging her leg and began preparing her for transport. As he worked, he noticed how she seemed to anticipate his movements, shifting her weight at exactly the right moments to make his job easier. It was the kind of cooperation that came from understanding medical evacuation procedures. "We need to get you out of here," Jake told her as he prepared a stretcher. "You're going to be okay." For the first time since he had found her, she made eye contact with him and held it. In that moment, Jake saw something that confirmed his growing suspicions. Behind the pain and exhaustion, he saw the steely determination of a warrior. This wasn't a civilian caught in the crossfire. This was someone who belonged in this world of combat and conflict. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared at Jake's shoulder. "We need to move. Document intel suggests more hostiles incoming." Jake nodded and began securing the woman to the stretcher. As they lifted her, she winced but made no sound. Even in pain, she maintained the stoic silence that was becoming her defining characteristic in Jake's mind. During the helicopter ride to the base hospital, Jake couldn't take his eyes off his patient. She lay still, her eyes closed, but he could tell she wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too controlled, too measured. She was doing the same thing he did during transport, running through mental checklists and staying alert despite her injuries. It was a survival mechanism taught in advanced military training. The helicopter's noise made conversation impossible, but Jake found himself studying every detail about her. The way her fingers occasionally tapped against her leg in what looked like a rhythm only she could hear. The way she would open her eyes periodically to check their location through the windows. The way she seemed to be listening to the radio chatter between the pilots, understanding more than she let on. As they approached the base, Jake made a decision. There was something about this woman that didn't add up, and he was going to find out what it was. His instincts had kept him alive through multiple deployments, and right now they were telling him that this silent woman was much more than she appeared to be. The mystery of who she was and why she had been in that clinic was going to drive him crazy until he found answers. The helicopter touched down at the base hospital with a gentle thud. As the medical team rushed out to meet them, Jake took one last look at his patient. Her eyes were open again, and she was watching the organized chaos of the medical response with the same calculating gaze she had shown in the clinic. She understood this world because she belonged in it. Jake was sure of it now. As they transferred her from the helicopter to the hospital gurney, Jake caught sight of her ankle tattoo again. This time, with better lighting and a different angle, he could make out more details. What he saw made his blood run cold, and his heart race simultaneously. There, barely visible beneath the dirt and medical tape, were numbers that looked suspiciously like a military service number. And above them, in small but clear letters, he could make out two words that changed everything: United States. The gurney disappeared through the hospital doors, taking his mysterious patient with it. Jake stood on the landing pad, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had seen. If his suspicions were correct, then the silent woman he had just treated wasn't a local civilian at all. She was an American soldier, possibly special operations, who had somehow ended up injured and alone in a hostile village. But how? And why wasn't she talking? As Jake gathered his gear and prepared to debrief the mission, one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this mystery go unsolved. Something had happened to this woman, something that had left her not just physically wounded, but apparently unwilling or unable to speak. His medic training told him to hand her over to the doctors and move on to the next mission. But his instincts told him that her story was far from over, and that somehow he was meant to be part of whatever came next. The base bustled with activity around him, but Jake stood still for a moment, staring at the hospital doors. Tomorrow, he would find a way to check on his patient. He would find out who she really was and what had happened to her. Because if there was one thing he had learned in his years as a SEAL medic, it was that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on the battlefield. Sometimes they were fought in the quiet moments afterward, when wounded warriors had to find their way back to themselves. And something told him that this silent woman was going to need all the help she could get. The next morning came too early for Jake Morrison. His sleep had been fitful, filled with dreams of silent eyes and hidden tattoos. He had tossed and turned most of the night, unable to shake the image of the mysterious woman from his mind. As soon as he finished his morning briefing and equipment check, he made his way to the base hospital, determined to get some answers. The hospital was a maze of corridors and bustling medical staff. Jake had been there many times before, either bringing in wounded teammates or getting treated for his own injuries. But today felt different. Today he wasn't here as a medic or a patient. He was here as someone seeking the truth about a woman who had managed to capture his attention in a way no one had before. He found Nurse Patricia Williams at the information desk, someone he had worked with on multiple occasions. Patricia was a no-nonsense veteran nurse who had seen everything the war could throw at a medical facility. "Jake, good to see you," she said with a warm smile. "What brings you to my domain today? Please tell me you're not injured." "Actually, I'm looking for a patient I brought in yesterday," Jake said, trying to sound casual. Young woman, dark hair, multiple lacerations, and possible internal injuries. She was brought in from the village extraction mission. Patricia's expression grew serious as she pulled up the patient records on her computer. "Oh, you mean Jane Doe in room 247, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a more professional tone. "I have to tell you, Jake, that patient is classified. The doctors have been trying to get information from her since she arrived, but she hasn't said a word to anyone. They're not even sure if she understands English." Jake felt his pulse quicken. A classified patient meant military involvement at a higher level than a simple civilian casualty. "What kind of injuries are we talking about?" he asked, his medical training taking over. Patricia glanced around to make sure no one was listening before leaning closer. "Besides the wounds you treated in the field, they found evidence of older injuries," she whispered. "Scars that suggest professional medical treatment, the kind you get in military hospitals. And Jake, they found something else. She has dental work that's definitely American military standard. The doctors think she might be one of ours." The confirmation hit Jake like a physical blow. His instincts had been right. The silent woman was an American soldier, which raised 1,000 new questions. How had she ended up in that village? Why wasn't she talking? And, most importantly, why didn't anyone seem to know who she was? "Can I see her?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. Patricia shook her head sympathetically. "Sorry, Jake. Orders from the top. No no será ista por cener. The military intelligence people have been in and out of here all morning. They're taking this very seriously." Jake nodded, understanding but frustrated. He was about to leave when Patricia caught his arm. "But, Jake, if you happen to be walking past room 247 during your lunch break, and if you happen to notice that the guard steps away for exactly 10 minutes at 1,300 hours for a cigarette break, well, that would just be a coincidence." At exactly 1,300 hours, Jake found himself walking past room 247. True to Patricia's word, the guard was nowhere to be seen. Jake glanced around quickly before slipping into the room. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. The woman lay in the hospital bed, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. She had been cleaned up and was wearing a standard hospital gown, but even in that sterile environment, she maintained the same alert posture he had noticed the day before. When she heard him enter, she turned her head toward him, and Jake saw recognition flicker in her eyes. "Hi," Jake said softly, closing the door behind him. "I am Jake Morrison. I was the medic who treated you yesterday." She watched him carefully, but said nothing. Jake pulled up a chair next to her bed and sat down. "I know you understand me. I can see it in your eyes." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Jake could see intelligence behind her gaze, along with something else, pain that went deeper than her physical injuries. "You're military, aren't you?" he asked gently. Something shifted in her expression, a tightening around her eyes that confirmed his suspicion. "I'm going to tell you something," Jake continued, keeping his voice low and calm. "Yesterday, when I was treating your ankle, I saw your tattoo. I saw the service numbers and United States. I know you're one of ours. The question is, what happened to you?" She continued to stare at him, but Jake could see an internal struggle playing out behind her eyes. Finally, she raised her hand and pointed to her throat, then shook her head slowly. Jake's medical training kicked in as he considered the possibilities. Physical trauma to the vocal cords, psychological trauma causing selective mutism, or perhaps something else entirely. "Can't speak or won't speak?" Jake asked. She hesitated for a moment, then held up 2 fingers. "Both." The gesture was small, but it was the first real communication she had offered anyone since her rescue. Jake felt a surge of something: victory, hope, and an unexpected protectiveness toward this wounded warrior. "Okay," Jake said, settling back in his chair. "We don't have to talk, but I want you to know something. Whatever happened to you out there, whatever you've been through, you're safe now. And I'm going to make sure you get the help you need." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Then, slowly, she reached over to the bedside table and picked up a pen. On a piece of paper, she wrote 2 words: "Thank you." Her handwriting was neat and precise, the kind that came from years of military reports and documentation. Jake felt something shift in his chest. This small gesture of trust meant more to him than he could explain. "Can you write your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then shook her head. Not because she couldn't, Jake realized, but because she chose not to. Whatever had happened to her had made her afraid to reveal her identity, even to someone trying to help her. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made both of them tense. Jake quickly stood up and moved away from the bed, pretending to check the medical equipment. The guard returned, giving Jake a suspicious look as he entered the room. "Sorry, just doing a routine equipment check," Jake said smoothly, making a note on the clipboard. The guard nodded but continued to watch him carefully. Jake gathered his things and headed for the door, but not before catching the woman's eye one more time. In that brief moment, he saw something that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, Jake found excuses to visit the hospital regularly. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of her through the window in her door. Other times he would chat with the nurses, gathering small pieces of information about her condition. What he learned painted a picture of someone struggling with deep psychological trauma. The doctors had determined that her vocal cords were physically fine. Her silence was a choice, driven by whatever psychological wounds she carried. She ate little, slept even less, and showed signs of hypervigilance that the psychiatrists recognized as severe post-traumatic stress. But she was also showing signs of improvement, small steps that gave everyone hope. Nurse Patricia told him that the woman had started responding to simple questions with nods or shakes of her head. She had begun writing short responses when directly asked medical questions. And, most encouraging of all, she had started showing interest in the activities around her, watching the staff work, and occasionally helping other patients in small ways when the nurses weren't looking. "She's got that same instinct you do, Jake," Patricia observed one afternoon. "Always helping others, even when she's the one who needs help. It's in her nature. Military through and through." The comment stuck with Jake as he went about his duties. During training exercises and mission briefings, he found his mind wandering to the silent woman in room 247. He had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers over the years, but something about her case felt different. Personal, as if her recovery was somehow tied to his own sense of purpose. It was on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after he had first found her, that Jake got the break he had been hoping for. He was walking past her room when he saw her standing by the window, fully dressed in civilian clothes that someone had brought for her. She was being discharged. Jake watched as a woman in a military uniform, someone he didn't recognize, escorted her from the room. As they passed him in the hallway, the mysterious patient looked directly at him. For just a moment, she slowed her pace and mouthed two words, "Find me." The message was clear, and Jake felt his pulse quicken. She was being taken somewhere, but she wanted him to follow. She wanted him to be part of whatever came next. As Jake watched her disappear around the corner, he made a silent promise. Whatever it took, wherever she was going, he would find her. Because some connections transcended duty and protocol. Some connections were about one human being reaching out to another in their darkest moment. That evening, Jake sat in his quarters, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had started and stopped writing a dozen times, trying to figure out how to begin his search for a woman whose name he didn't even know. But he had her service number memorized from that brief glimpse of her tattoo. He had the date and location of her rescue. And most importantly, he had the memory of her eyes, looking at him with a trust that felt sacred. Tomorrow, he would begin making inquiries. He would use every contact and favor he had accumulated over his years of service. Because somewhere out there was a woman who had been through hell and back, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Jake Morrison knew that finding her was the most important mission of his life. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison had watched the mysterious woman disappear from the base hospital, and his search for her had consumed every free moment of his time. Using the service number he had memorized from her ankle tattoo, he had reached out to contacts throughout the military community. What he discovered was both shocking and heartbreaking, painting a picture of a woman whose sacrifice had been erased from official records. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez had been one of the first women to serve in special operations, part of a classified program that technically didn't exist. According to Jake's contact in military intelligence, a sympathetic warrant officer named David Chun, who owed Jake a favor from a previous deployment, Elena had been attached to various Special Forces units as a cultural support team member. But her real role had been far more dangerous. She was one of the best, Chen had told Jake during a discreet meeting at a coffee shop off base. Spoke 4 languages fluently, could blend into any environment, and had more combat experience than most of the men she served with. But 18 months ago, her unit was compromised during a deep cover operation. She was captured. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Captured meant torture, interrogation, and worse. It explained the scars the hospital doctors had found, the ones that spoke of professional medical treatment. Elena had been held for 8 months before managing to escape during a prisoner transport. By the time she had made it to friendly territory, the program she had worked for had been shut down due to political pressure. Officially, she never existed. Chun continued, his voice heavy with disgust. The politicians couldn't handle the idea that we had women in combat roles that dangerous, so they buried the whole program. Elena and the other women who served were given new identities and transferred to administrative roles. But Elena never reported to her new assignment. Jake stared into his coffee, processing the information. She went AWOL. More like she fell through the cracks, Chen replied. The trauma from her captivity was severe. PTSD, survivor's guilt, selective mutism. The military psychiatrist recommended immediate treatment. But before they could process her transfer to a specialized facility, she disappeared from the hospital. That was 6 months ago. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Elena had been living off the grid, probably struggling with her demons while trying to avoid being forced back into a system that had already betrayed her once. Her presence in that Afghan village suggested she had been trying to help others, using her skills for humanitarian purposes while staying under the radar. Where is she now? Jake asked, though he suspected Chen wouldn't have that information. That's where it gets complicated, Chun said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. After you brought her in, certain people in the Pentagon became interested in her case again. She's been transferred to a private military contractor facility in Virginia, supposedly for debriefing and medical evaluation, but I think they want to use her experience for training purposes. Problem is, she still isn't talking to anyone. Jake felt anger surge through him. Elena had already given more than enough in service to her country. The idea that bureaucrats were trying to squeeze more out of her while she was still healing made his blood boil. "Can you give me the address?" Shun hesitated. "Jake, these aren't people you want to mess with. This facility has connections all the way to the top. If you go poking around, it could end your career." "Some things are more important than career," Jake replied, his voice firm with conviction. Chun studied his face for a long moment, then slid a piece of paper across the table. "The address is on there," Chun said quietly. "But, Jake, be careful. And if anyone asks where you got this information, you never met me." 2 days later, Jake used his accumulated leave time to drive to Virginia. The facility was located in a remote area outside of Richmond, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. It looked more like a prison than a medical center, which only reinforced Jake's determination to see Elena again. Getting inside proved easier than he had expected. His sealed credentials and medical background, combined with his story about conducting research on combat trauma treatment, got him through the front gate. Once inside, he learned that Elena was being housed in what they called the residential treatment wing, though the barred windows suggested a different reality. Jake found her in a common area, sitting alone at a table by the window. She was thinner than when he had last seen her, and there was a hollowness in her eyes that spoke of someone who had given up hope. But when she saw him enter the room, something shifted in her expression. Surprise, followed by something that might have been relief. "Hello, Elena," Jake said softly, using her real name for the first time. Her eyes widened, and he could see her processing the implications of his knowledge. "Yes, I know who you are, and I know what they did to you." She gestured for him to sit across from her, her movements careful and controlled. Jake noticed that she was wearing civilian clothes, but they were obviously provided by the facility, generic and impersonal. Everything about this place seemed designed to strip away individuality and identity. "I've been looking for you," Jake continued, keeping his voice low so the facility staff wouldn't overhear. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened to you, about why you were in that village. I had to know you were okay." Elena picked up a pen from the table and wrote on a napkin, "Why?" It was a simple question, but Jake could see the depth of emotion behind it. In her experience, people didn't go out of their way to help her without wanting something in return. "Because I've never met anyone stronger," Jake replied honestly. "What you survived, what you've been through, it would have broken most people. But you're still fighting, still trying to help others, even when you were wounded and alone. That's the kind of person the world needs more of." For the first time since he had known her, Jake saw tears in Elena's eyes. She quickly wiped them away and wrote another note. "They want me to remember everything, every detail of my captivity. They say it's for training purposes, but it feels like torture." Jake's hands clenched into fists under the table. The idea of forcing Elena to relive her trauma for the benefit of training programs was unconscionable. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said firmly. "You serve your country above and beyond the call of duty. No one has the right to demand more from you." Elena wrote quickly. "They say I can't leave until I complete the debriefing process. But every time I try to talk about it, I freeze up. The words won't come." Jake leaned forward, his voice intense, but gentle. "Then don't talk. There are other ways to heal, other ways to process trauma. You don't owe them your pain." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a stern-looking woman in a business suit. "Visiting hours are over," she announced, though Jake could see by his watch that he had only been there for 20 minutes. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you have a long drive back to your base." The fact that she knew his name and destination confirmed Jake's suspicion that his visit was being monitored. As he stood to leave, Elena grabbed his hand and pressed a small piece of paper into his palm. Their eyes met for a moment, and Jake saw a desperate plea in her gaze. Outside in the parking lot, Jake unfolded the paper. In Elena's precise handwriting were 3 words, "Get me out." Jake sat in his car for a long time, staring at those words and thinking about what they meant. Elena was being held in a facility that claimed to be helping her, but was clearly more interested in exploiting her experience. She was a war hero who had been erased from official records, trapped in a system that saw her as a resource rather than a human being who deserved to heal in peace. The drive back to base gave Jake plenty of time to think. By the time he arrived at his quarters, he had made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Elena Vasquez had spent her entire military career rescuing others, often at great personal cost. Now it was time for someone to rescue her. Jake spent the next week planning carefully. He used his medical connections to research treatment facilities that specialized in trauma recovery, places that would focus on Elena's healing rather than exploiting her experiences. He liquidated his savings account and arranged for extended leave under the pretense of dealing with a family emergency. But most importantly, he reached out to a network of veterans and active duty personnel who had become disillusioned with how the military treated its wounded warriors. Through encrypted communications and careful inquiries, Jake found others who were willing to help Elena disappear from the system that had already failed her once. The plan was risky and would likely end his military career, but Jake had reached a point where his conscience mattered more than his rank or his future prospects. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, and Elena Vasquez was worth saving. On a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 1 month after he had first met Elena in that bombed-out clinic, Jake Morrison drove back to Virginia with a cargo van and a small team of volunteers. It was time to give a forgotten hero the chance to find peace and healing on her own terms. The woman who had sacrificed everything for her country was finally going to get the rescue she deserved. The extraction from the Virginia facility happened at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the staff shift change created a 15-minute window of reduced security. Jake had spent weeks studying the facility's routines, timing guard rotations, and mapping exit routes. With the help of 2 retired Special Forces operators who believed Elena deserved better than being trapped in a bureaucratic prison, the operation went smoothly. Elena was waiting by her window when Jake appeared outside, having disabled the security camera that monitored that section of the building. She had packed nothing because she owned nothing that mattered to her. When Jake helped her climb through the window, she moved with the fluid grace of someone whose combat training had never truly left her, despite months of captivity and trauma. The drive to their destination took 12 hours, winding through back roads and small towns to avoid highway cameras and checkpoints. Elena sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape change from Virginia's rolling hills to the mountains of North Carolina. She had written a single question on a piece of paper when they started. "Where are we going?" Jake had shown her the brochure for Mountain View Recovery Center, a private facility that specialized in treating veterans with severe PTSD. Unlike the government facility she had escaped from, this place focused on healing rather than exploitation. It's run by a former Army psychiatrist named Dr. Sarah Chun, Jake explained as they drove. She served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understands what you've been through. No interrogations, no forced debriefings, just healing. Elena had nodded and settled back in her seat, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. Trust didn't come easily when you had been betrayed by the very system you had sworn to serve. It would take time for her to believe that this was really about her well-being rather than someone else's agenda. Mountain View Recovery Center was exactly what its name suggested, a collection of rustic cabins nestled in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. Dr. Sarah Chun met them at the main building, a warm woman in her 50s whose kind eyes held the understanding that came from personal experience with trauma. "Elena," she said simply, extending her hand. "I'm Sada. Jake has told me a little about what you've been through, but I want you to know that here, you control your story. You share what you want, when you want, and only if you want. Our job is to help you heal on your terms." Elena shook Dr. Chen's hand, but remained silent. However, Jake could see something in her posture that hadn't been there before, a slight relaxation, as if she was allowing herself to believe that this might be different. "Jake will be staying in one of our guest cabins for a few weeks," Dr. Chun continued, addressing Elena directly. We find that having a trusted friend nearby can help with the initial transition. But ultimately, this is your journey, and you decide how much contact you want with the outside world. Over the following weeks, Jake watched Elena begin the slow process of healing. The mountain's setting seemed to agree with her. She would spend hours sitting on her cabin porch, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and pink. Gradually, she began participating in the center's activities. Art therapy, where she painted abstract landscapes that seemed to capture emotions she couldn't yet voice. Equine therapy, where she formed a bond with a gentle mare named Spirit, who had also survived trauma. Jake spent his days helping with maintenance around the center, finding peace in the simple work of repairing fences and maintaining trails. In the evenings, he would often find Elena on her porch, and they would sit together in comfortable silence. Their communication remained primarily through written notes, but the notes became longer and more personal as the weeks passed. "Why did you give up your career for me?" she wrote one evening, her handwriting more flowing than the tight script she had used in the early days. Jay considered the question carefully before responding aloud. "Because some things matter more than career advancement. You spent years putting yourself in danger to protect others. You deserve to have someone do the same for you." Elena stared at him for a long moment, then wrote, "I haven't been worth saving for a very long time." "That's the trauma talking," Jake replied gently. "The Elena I met in that clinic, wounded and silent but still alert and strong, that woman is absolutely worth saving. The woman who survived 8 months of captivity and still tried to help others in that village is worth saving. The woman who's been fighting every day just to stay alive is worth saving." It was 3 months into Elena's stay at Mountain View when Jake heard her speak for the first time. He was working in the garden behind the main building when he heard voices from the direction of the horse paddock. One was Dr. Chen's familiar tone, and the other was soft and hesitant, but unmistakably Elena's voice. "She's beautiful," Elena was saying, referring to the mare she had been working with. "Reminds me of a horse my grandfather had when I was little, before everything got complicated." Jake stayed where he was, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a sacred moment. Elena's voice was rusty from months of disuse, but it carried a strength that spoke of someone fighting their way back to themselves. We mentioned the incident to Dr. Chen later. She smiled knowingly. "She's been talking in therapy for about a week now," Dr. Chen explained. "Short sentences at first, but she's making remarkable progress." The selective mutism was a protective mechanism her mind created after the trauma. As she begins to feel safe again, her natural voice is returning. The breakthrough came during Elena's 4th month at the center. Jake was reading on his cabin porch when Elena approached, walking with the confident stride he remembered from their first meeting. She sat down in the chair beside him and, for the first time since he had known her, spoke directly to him. "Jake," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I need to tell you something." Jake set down his book and gave her his full attention. Elena took a deep breath before continuing. "I remember everything from that village. I wasn't there by accident. I've been trying to get back to the base to report what I had learned about the people who held me captive. Important intelligence about their operations and plans." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But when I saw those wounded civilians in the clinic, I couldn't just walk past them. So I stayed to help, even though I knew it was dangerous. That's when the attack happened." Jake nodded, understanding. "You chose to help others, even when you were trying to complete your own mission. That's exactly the kind of person I knew you were." "The intelligence I gathered," Elena continued, "it's still in my head. Names, locations, operational details that could save lives. But I've been afraid to share it because I know what will happen. They'll want to use me again, send me back into situations where I might not survive." Jake considered this revelation carefully. Elena was carrying information that could be valuable to national security, but sharing it would likely mean being pulled back into the world that had already cost her so much. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle high above the mountains. "I want to find a way to share what I know without losing myself again. Maybe through written reports or debriefings conducted here where I feel safe. I owe it to the people who might be hurt if I stay silent. Dr. Chun helped arrange a series of controlled debriefings with carefully vetted intelligence officers who came to Mountain View rather than demanding Elena return to official facilities. The process took several weeks, but Elena was able to provide detailed intelligence while maintaining her agency and sense of safety. As Elena shared her information, Jake began making plans for their future. His military career was effectively over. Helping Elena escape from the Virginia facility had burned those bridges permanently. But he found he didn't regret his choice. Some decisions defined who you were as a person, and saving Elena had been one of those moments. I've been thinking about what comes next, Jake told Elena one evening as they watched the sunset from her porch. I've been offered a position with a veterans organization that helps former special operations personnel transition to civilian life. It would mean traveling around the country, setting up support networks, and treatment programs. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you're meant to do. You have a gift for seeing people who are struggling and knowing how to help them. I was hoping you might consider joining me, Jake said carefully. Not as a patient or someone who needs rescuing, but as a partner. You understand trauma recovery better than most professionals because you've lived it. You could help design programs that actually work for people like us. Elena was quiet for a long time, and Jake worried he had pushed too hard too fast. But when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with something he hadn't heard before. Hope. "I'd like that," she said simply. "I'd like to help other people find their way back to themselves. And I like to do it with someone who understands that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help." 6 months later, Jake Morrison and Elena Vasquez stood together at the opening ceremony of the first Mountain View Outreach Center, a satellite facility designed to bring specialized trauma treatment to veterans in rural communities. Elena had found her voice again, both literally and figuratively, becoming a powerful advocate for forgotten warriors who had fallen through the cracks of the system. In his opening remarks, Jake talked about the importance of recognizing that strength came in many forms. Some of our greatest heroes are people who have faced impossible situations and found ways to survive and thrive despite overwhelming odds, he said, looking directly at Elena. Their stories remind us that healing isn't weakness. It's the greatest victory of all. Elena spoke last, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the crowd of veterans and their families. "For a long time, I thought I had lost my voice forever," she said. "But what I learned is that sometimes silence is just the beginning of finding new ways to speak. Today, we're creating a place where every veteran's voice can be heard, where every story matters, and where healing happens on each person's own terms." As the crowd applauded, Jake caught Elena's eye and saw in her face the woman he had first glimpsed in that bombed-out clinic, strong, determined, and absolutely unbreakable. The journey from that moment to this one had been long and difficult, marked by pain and loss and moments when giving up seemed like the only option. But they had made it through together, two warriors who had found in each other the strength to keep fighting for something better. Elena had found her voice again, and Jake had found his true calling. Most importantly, they had both learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with compassion, persistence, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved a chance to heal and find their way home.